What if I told you that the Reformation didn't just give us Protestantism, but also played a role in inventing restaurants? And not just restaurant, but the whole idea that anyone, not just the rich or the invited, could walk into a public place, sit down at a table, and pay for a meal. With that came conversation, cross-class mixing, and something else unexpected: the early stirrings of a more participatory society, maybe even democracy, fermented slowly like a strong ale in the back rooms of Tudor taverns. Because for much of English history, eating wasn't a public act. You ate at home, or if you were poor and desperate, you relied on the charity of religious houses, monasteries, and abbeys that gave food as part of their spiritual mission. But when Henry VIII smashed that part of the system in the 1530s, it left a hole in English hospitality that something or someone had to fill. So let's go back. Before the pub became an institution, before the menu, before the humble tablecloth, let's travel to 15th century England and watch public dining become a cultural revolution. Hey friend, welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I'm dropping in this shorter episode podcast today because I've been reading a book about the history of eating out. And it's really interesting and fascinating. And I just got done with the chapter on medieval and Tudor England. And I just had to put something out on the channel because it was so interesting. So I'm going to put a link to the book down below. You can check it out. But in the meantime, let us travel back and talk about how, in fact, it could be that the Reformation led to restaurants, participatory government, and possibly even the very nascent stirrings of democracy. Let's dig in. Before restaurants, taverns, and gastropubs, most people in England ate in one of two places: their own homes or the homes of others, usually family or friends. Meals were private affairs. If you were traveling, you didn't expect to find a hot meal at the end of the road. Instead, you hoped to stumble on a monastery, a priory, or an abbey. Really, any religious house where Christian duty meant food for the hungry and shelter for the stranger. There were cookshops, of course, especially in cities where people didn't have access to ovens in their own home. These were small stalls or sheds where hot food could be bought on the go. You might grab a meat pie or cheese in the marketplace, but you weren't going to sit down. You weren't going to be served, and you certainly weren't going to be offered a menu. No chairs, no table, no wine, no ambiance. In short, eating out, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. In 1410, a man from Kent walked into London searching not for food, but for justice. He was the central figure in a poem called London Lick Penny, a biting satire on the corruption of English courts. He'd been robbed and he wanted to petition the government at Westminster. But everywhere he turned, he was asked for bribes. Judges, clerks, lawyers all demanded coin before they'd lift a quill. As he trudged through the city, he also gave us one of the first recorded food tours in English literature. In East Cheap, he passed noisy cookshops, the kind that roasted meat in the street, the air thick with smoke and clanging pewter. Cooks shouted out their dishes to passerby: rips of beef, savory pies, puddings, a sort of medieval fast food row, chaotic and crude. But when he arrived in Westminster, the seat of government, something was different. There, near the gates of power, he found a dining house unlike any other. The cooks greeted him respectfully. They offered him beef ribs, bread, ale, and wine, and if that wasn't civilized enough, they laid out a tablecloth. A cloth. On the table. In public. He didn't stay because he couldn't afford it. But in that moment, a line was crossed. This wasn't food as charity, it was food as commerce. Hospitality had been transformed into transaction. And that is where the restaurant began. So why Westminster? It wasn't that it was quieter than East Cheap. By the early 1400s, Westminster had become the beating heart of English government. Parliament, still in its very early stages, was evolving from an occasional gathering of barons into a regular meeting of knights, lawyers, merchants, even clerks. These weren't peasants or nobles, they were the professional class, educated, salaried, and hungry. And as they came to Westminster to draft laws, review petitions, and haggle over taxes, they needed somewhere nearby to eat. Not a grimy street stall, not a monastery. They needed real food, fast, and within walking distance of the hall. And so, right next door to power, dining establishments began to shift. The service was a bit more polished, the food was better. And yes, the tables, they were covered in linen. The era of the professional diner had arrived. These weren't cook shops, these were proto restaurants, and they thrived because they served the people who were shaping the laws of the land. So, if you are the kind of person who finds this invention of the restaurant thrilling, and honestly, if you've made it this far, you probably are, then TudorCon is for you. Of course, in person tickets are sold out, but TudorCon from home you can attend from anywhere in the world. It's a weekend virtually of talks, music, merriment with fellow Tudor history nerds from around the globe. It is October 3rd through 5th. Go to englandcast.com/TudorCon from home to learn more, see the speakers, see what we do, see the schedule. And we will hope to spend the weekend, October 3rd through 5th, with you. Just 4 weeks from today, we will be right in the middle of TudorCon, and I can't wait to see you online. All right, let's get back into it. If Westminster gave birth to fine dining, the Reformation handed it a growth spurt and a pub sign. Because in the 1530s, Henry VIII, he famously broke with Rome, and this didn't just result in a new church. It triggered the dissolution of the monasteries, a brutal and swift dismantling of centuries of religious infrastructure. Within 5 years, nearly 800 monasteries, abbeys, and convents were seized, emptied, and either sold off or left to rot. And along with their land and libraries went something else: hospitality. Monasteries had always been the safety net for travelers, a warm bed, a bowl of stew, and a bit of bread if you were lucky. You didn't need money, you just needed to show up. When all that disappeared, it left a gaping hole in English life. Suddenly, there was nowhere to stay and nothing to eat unless you had cash. So what filled the gap? Taverns, alehouses, cookshops, inns, paid places. Former monks and monastery staff, now unemployed and sometimes landless, opened commercial ventures. Locals with a bit of enterprise also took over the old hospitality roles, now with a price tag. The state stepped in with regulations, price caps, and taxes, but it didn't slow the boom. By 1577, there were 24,000 alehouses in England, one for every 142 people. A generation later, the number had doubled. The pub was no longer just a place to drink, it was now the social anchor, the dining space, a paid public shared table. Now, once alehouses stopped being just watering holes and started offering food, real, hot, cooked meals, something subtle and yet seismic began to happen. People from different walks of life began to eat together. And while we might take that for granted today, in the Tudor period, it was actually really quite radical. In churches, food had been handed out as charity, an act of grace, not choice. In monasteries, hospitality was structured around obedience and hierarchy. But in a tavern, you were a paying customer. No one was giving you a crust of bread just out of pity. You ordered your mutton, you paid your pennies, and you claimed your place at the table. That shift from receiving to choosing was about more than dinner. It meant that a servant, a clerk, a visiting merchant might sit near each other, overhear each other, even start talking. The alehouse became this space where the classes began to mingle. And not just men. Women, too, went to these places, especially in towns and cities, sometimes even running the establishments themselves. Even back into the medieval times, being a brewer was one of the most popular jobs for women. And so then it wasn't a huge jump for these women to actually start cooking meals. And with that food came conversation. With conversation came awareness. People grumbled about their landlords, about taxes, about the weather, sure, but also about the system. And then the pub became more than just a place to get fed. It became a crucible for thought. By the mid-16th century, a new kind of eating establishment was popping up in English towns: the ordinary. Despite the name, these places were anything but boring. An ordinary meant a fixed price meal with a set menu served at a shared table. A little like dining hall meets prefix menu. You paid your coins, you took your seat, often among strangers, and the food arrived in courses: roast meat, stewed goose, maybe some rabbit, a tart, a bit of cheese. If you wanted wine, that was extra. Ordinaries were particularly appealing to students and travelers, people with limited time and money who still wanted something hot and filling. Some were more refined than others, and some, especially in London, catered to wealthier diners with finer palates and deeper pockets. Foreign visitors were both fascinated and also horrified. In 1562, a Venetian merchant named Alessandro Magno visited an inn called the Bull, run by an Italian expat. He raved about the oysters. They were roasted, fried, stewed, or raw, but could barely choke down the beer, describing it as cloudy like a horse's urine. Still, the food impressed him. For the first time in England, there were menus, multiple options, table service, and people were going out for the experience, not just to fill their tummies. By the end of the 16th century, the English landscape had changed politically, religiously, and culinarily. Is that a word, culinarily? I think so. I'm making it a word. But what began with monasteries collapsing and cookshops springing up in the cracks turned into a full-blown culture of public eating. Alehouses, they were everywhere. Taverns served full meals. Ordinaries offered fixed menus, and more people were paying for their food and paying attention to who else was at the table. Because of this act of eating together, something else began to ferment. These new spaces offered conversation, exposure, and choice. You could sit beside someone wealthier or poorer than you. You could talk about harvests and taxes and bishops and queens. You weren't being fed by a monk out of Christian duty. You were choosing to spend your coin. And in doing so, you were exercising your own agency. And that was actually very much quite revolutionary. And it didn't stop there. As the 17th century dawned, a new beverage would arrive from the East. It was black, and it was bitter, and it was buzzing with potential, and that was coffee. But that's a story for another day. If you would like me to move on from the Tudor period and talk about the coffee houses of the 17th century, I'm quite happy to do that too. But what matters for our story here is this. The fall of religious hospitality made room for restaurants, and restaurants in their own way made room for democracy, one tablecloth at a time. So I will add a link to the book that I've been really enjoying. It's called The Restaurant, A History of Eating Out. It's by William Sitwell. I'll add a link in the description below. But this is all from the 4th chapter, I think it is, on medieval and Tudor London. So maybe tomorrow I will drop back in with a little bit more on the coffee house, because that is also equally interesting. It's just a little bit beyond the period that I normally talk about, but I can always make an exception for such an exciting story. And it really does go to show how much of a nerd I am that I get excited by stories like this. But you probably are too, because you made it this far in the episode. And so yay, history nerds unite. What was the last great eating out meal experience that you had? Let me know in the comments. I would love to know your favorite restaurant and your favorite place to eat, or if you had a super memorable experience eating out. And, the next time you go out and grab a bite to eat or go to like a fast casual place, you can thank Henry and the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries for that. Who knew, right? All right, friend, thanks so much for listening and spending this time with me. I will be back again very soon. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, I sure would appreciate a press of that like button. And I hope I earned your subscription to my channel, where I put out videos and content and podcast episodes like this on the regular. Have an amazing day, my friend. Have an amazing weekend. Bye-bye.